So in summary, I think I put this on your handout because it's a mouthful. This is my account. Beauty delights. It is the experience of transcendent form. These forms are God made manifest in the world, that is Theophany. This delight wakes us up to our truest selves, beckons us to God, ignites our innermost desire for participation in communion with God, that is theosis. Moreover, the true sight of this experience, how do you get some of this, right, is Jesus Christ, the true archetype of man, the full revelation of God. And our experience of Christ is fundamentally liturgical, sacramental, and iconic. That's my thesis, let's say. I'm going to try to prove it to you, to demonstrate it in the rest of our time together through the coming weeks. Now, I'd like to conclude with a little bit of about 20 minutes here, talk about modernity. Because I'm not just going to talk about ancient philosophy or the church fathers or scripture. I want to talk about where we're at now and how we got here and why it's so different than the vision of the church and of the Holy Fathers. And that, of course, has something to do with modernity. And I asked some of you at the beginning of this, our time today, what you thought beauty was. And I got lots of answers. Eye of the beholder, symmetry, proportion, coherence, something about passion, if I recall, certain kind of, right, there's something there. But interestingly, some of those have some classical antecedents, no doubt, but a lot of those are modern. And so I have this little graph for you, and it's, in something like 20 minutes, I can't possibly, with all the nuance, each of these philosophers, thinkers, very nuanced thinker, and I could qualify in all kinds of ways, but I want to give the kind of gist, right, of some of these thinkers, what we might consider their theory about beauty, and kind of an explanation of that. And I hope you'll begin to see why this is so radically different than the Orthodox view of beauty. I actually start with Aquinas, maybe unfairly in some ways. I mean, Aquinas in some ways is following Aristotle, and Aristotle in some ways following Plato. But Aristotle does, unlike Plato and unlike the rest of the Platonists, tend to think of beauty as ultimately a kind of formal question, right, in terms of symmetry, proportion, and so on. Aquinas, masterfully to his credit, does think that we can explain beauty by these formal categories. And so you might call his theory a kind of formalism or objectivism. I named these myself most of the time, so don't hold me to it, just for ease of understanding. And so Aquinas thinks something is beautiful if the object in question displays integrity. That's kind of related to coherence, proportionality, and what he calls brilliancy. It's unclear whether by brilliancy he means something like quite literal, like it's shiny, right? It gives a kind of light, it's got a kind of hue to it, it's got nice colors. He might not, that's debatable. Nonetheless, all of this explanation is on the side of the object. It's like, here's the thing, is it beautiful? What boxes do I check to discern whether it is? Then you have someone like Hume. David Hume has the closest thing to a subjectivist understanding of beauty. As if Aquinas is like, the object is what I care about, Hume is like, look, beauty's got something to do with me. It's got nothing to do with the object. And what's it have to do with me? Good taste. So he's not like a total subjectivist in the sense of like he thinks it's all fair game. He just thinks when we talk about saying something is beauty, we're asking whether the person in question has the appropriate good taste to discern beauty. This is very puzzling because it's like, what are you discerning if there's no beauty out there? It's just in the subject. But nonetheless, it has something to do with good taste in the subject. And how do you get this good taste? Well, you have a strong sense of it, and just in general, I might say if someone's gifted. You have a delicate sentiment. You've begun to cultivate it a little bit. You have the right habits. You've been hanging out with, at art exhibits and talking to people who study art. Maybe don't do that. And you have the right range. You've done all kinds of things. You've experienced all kinds of stuff, both beautiful and ugly. And you lack prejudice in your evaluation of beauty. You got no obvious self-interest. And so, in this case, like I said, Hume is really putting the onus of beauty on the question of the taste in the subject. But then you have Kant. Goes in a totally different direction. Not entirely, it's still kind of subjective, but for him, famously, if you're familiar with Kant's ethics, Deontology, it's about duty. So what's beauty? Beauty is disinterested satisfaction. It's enjoyed for its own sake. Something is beautiful when you've got no skin in the game. You just look at it and go, ah, yes, beautiful. And then you just kind of walk away, right? Think about what you will. Common, right? Beauty is what's ever pleasurable. If it's pleasurable, it contributes to your happiness, you got yourself some beauty. And in this case, of course, beauty starts to look kind of relative, right? Because then it's like, where do I stop here if it's really just about pleasure and it's what I want to do, what contributes to my happiness, we start to lose any sense of objective beauty. For you and I to sit around and debate whether this is beautiful or not, is everyone loses that debate, right? Because it just matters what I happen to find pleasing, and human beings can find some pretty perverse things pleasing. So, not a great account. Nietzsche, who I began with our quote, is really where you get hard, like a hard relativism, and an account of power. Beauty is not just relative, but it's whoever is stronger. And we'll spend some time with Nietzsche because I think he's in some sense the best atheist, and he's so important, I think, to our contemporary life. Beauty is will to power. If you're powerful and you exercise it in your own self-interest, glorious. If you're the blonde beast of prey, crushing the skull of the lamb, it's kind of, it's almost this romantic, sort of virulent life force, right? You can kind of say the Viking, in the heat of battle, taking lives, getting glory. It's like, beauty, right? And it's true. It's kind of what Nietzsche has in mind, this kind of untamable life that dominates everything in its path. It's beautiful, and we should see it that way. And then finally, there's Freud. Kind of libidinal sublimation here. I don't want to go too deep into Freud, but everything, beauty in particular, is rooted in sexual attraction of some sort of initial sexual pleasure that then, of course, starts to get removed and sublimated in certain ways. So there's obvious ways in which that's the case, like you find someone of the opposite sex attractive, right? Beautiful. But that's not quite what Freud has in mind. And yeah, that's true, but in a higher sense, you start to find things that aren't so obviously related to that attractive. What he thinks you're doing there is you're getting away from the thing you can't have, and you're finding ways of trying to satisfy this desire you have in ways that are socially acceptable. And again, we'll spend some time with Freud as well. And so in this case, things like art are a kind of illusory wish fulfillment. I make art because I have some desire that I can't satisfy, that society doesn't want me to satisfy, my clan doesn't want me to satisfy, it gets repressed, I need some way of satisfying it, I'm making art which isn't quite obviously the object of my satisfaction, but nonetheless, it gets the job done. So it's a kind of illusion. I say all this because we're going to touch on each of these thinkers in some way. Each class will kind of parallel some things, so I want to talk about Freud versus Plato, because they both have different accounts of eros, different accounts of desire, and what desire is for, and how it comes to be, and what are its objects, and what role it plays in our lives. I want to talk about Nietzsche in light of the gospel itself, in light of the humble, meek Christ crucified versus Nietzsche's Übermensch, and see those two different accounts of beauty. And I could say more, but we'll touch on each of those. To conclude, quote from Schmemann, "The term sacramental means here that the basic and primordial intuition which not only expresses itself in worship, but of which the entire worship is indeed phenomenon, both effect and experience, is that the world, be it in its totality as cosmos, or in its life and becoming as time and history, is an epiphany, or theophany, of God, a means of his revelation, presence, and power." And so I want to attempt to unpack what is essentially a kind of Schmemannian account of beauty. That what we are doing here is theophany, and why we care about beauty is theophany, and why we have icons is theophany, and why we engage in liturgy is theophany, and why we baptize people is theophany. And that ultimately all of that is so central to what it means to be human, and teaches us about the world, about ourselves, and ultimately is our eternal destination and union with God.